What does it take for a superpower to say we are coming for you? Not with tanks, not with missiles, but with the cold precision of a bureaucratic investigation that could destroy your economy. Tonight, 60 nations around the world are waking up to that exact reality, and Canada, our Canada, sits squarely on that list. Good evening. This is breaking news that every Canadian needs to hear and understand, because what the Trump administration announced this week is not simply another trade headline to be scrolled past. It is a declaration. It is an ultimatum wrapped in legal language, and it is aimed directly at us. The United States Trade Representative has just launched formal Section 301 investigations into 60 countries, including Canada. If you are wondering what that means, allow me to explain it in the clearest possible terms. A Section 301 investigation is the legal mechanism that Donald Trump used to justify over $360 billion in tariffs against China beginning in 2018. Those tariffs never went away. They reshaped global supply chains. They devastated Chinese exporters in certain sectors. They triggered a trade war that still reverberates through the world economy today. And now that same weapon is pointed at our forehead. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer announced that his office is moving to complete these investigations in a matter of months, not years, months. When asked what this means for countries found to be engaging in unfair trading practices, Greer was blunt. He said if countries have been involved in unfair trading practices such as subsidies, excess capacity, or forced labor, his office will quantify that harm to U.S. commerce and then try to resolve that issue with that country. And if the country does not resolve the issue, then the Trump administration will impose tariffs. Let those words sink in for a moment. Canada, our closest ally and largest trading partner to the United States, is now officially under investigation for potentially unfair trade practices. This is not speculation. This is not a threat floating in the ether. This is a formal legal process initiated by the United States government that could result in permanent tariffs on Canadian goods. The timing here is absolutely critical to understand. Last month, the United States Supreme Court struck down Trump's favorite tariff tool in a landmark ruling in the case Learning Resources in Chorus versus Trump. By a 6-3 vote, the Supreme Court ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. This was devastating for Trump. EPA was the legal basis for his Liberation Day tariffs. It was the basis for his fentanyl-related duties on Canada, Mexico, and China. The Supreme Court essentially said the president had been acting without legal authority for months. So what did Trump do? He pivoted. Within hours of that ruling, he signed an executive order imposing a new 10% global tariff using Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. But here is the problem. Section 122 tariffs can only increase to 15%, and they expire after 150 days unless Congress votes to extend them. An extension would be unlikely to get congressional approval. Trump knows this. His administration knows this. So they need a new tool. They need a legal framework that can impose permanent, lasting, devastating tariffs. And that tool is Section 301. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition. We watched this exact playbook unfold against China. In 2018, the Office of the United States Trade Representative launched a Section 301 investigation into China, alleging intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and unfair trade practices. That investigation led to findings that justified tariffs on over $360 billion worth of Chinese imports. Those tariffs ranged from 7-12% to 25%. They were applied in 4 separate trenches across thousands of product categories. And here is the most important part. Those tariffs are still in effect today. In 2026, the Biden administration raised some of them even higher. And Trump has made clear he intends to expand them further. So when the Trump administration says it is launching a Section 301 investigation into Canada, we should understand exactly what we are looking at. We are looking at a legal roadmap to permanent tariffs. We are looking at a framework for economic coercion that can survive court challenges. We are looking at the potential end of free trade as we have known it between Canada and the United States for nearly 4 decades. What exactly is Canada being investigated for? The official justification cited in the announcement is forced labor. Yes, you read that correctly. The United States is investigating whether Canada has adequately enforced measures banning goods produced with forced labor from entering our markets. This is rich coming from an administration that withdrew from international labor agreements and gutted domestic labor enforcement. But the specifics almost do not matter because Section 301 is extraordinarily broad in scope. Greer said his office will look at whether countries have policies or practices that are unreasonable or discriminatory and burden or restrict U.S. commerce. That language could mean anything. That language could cover any policy the United States decides it does not like. And we know there are specific irritants the Trump administration has been waiting to address. Canada's dairy supply management system has been a target of American complaints for decades. Trump himself has repeatedly complained about it, claiming without evidence that Canada charges tariffs of 250% to 400% on American dairy products. The reality is far more nuanced. Canada's system establishes tariff rate quotas that allow American dairy imports duty-free up to certain limits. The United States has never come close to hitting those limits. American dairy is not being charged those sky-high tariffs because American dairy is not exceeding the quota thresholds, but facts have never stopped Donald Trump before. Provincial bans on the sale of American alcohol have also been cited by Greer as barriers that make it difficult to negotiate with Canada. Individual provinces control their own alcohol markets through agencies like the LCBO in Ontario or the SAQ in Quebec. These systems predate Confederation in some cases. They are deeply embedded in Canadian governance, and the Trump administration sees them as trade barriers to be eliminated, but it goes deeper than dairy and alcohol. The mandatory review of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement is scheduled for 2026. Trump has cast doubt on his commitment to CUSMA, calling it irrelevant and saying it may have served its purpose. These are not the words of a leader who values the existing trade framework. These are the words of a leader looking for leverage to fundamentally renegotiate or abandon it entirely. We as Canadians need to understand what is at stake here. 75% of our exports go to the United States. Our economies are not just linked, they are fused at the cellular level. Every car assembled in Ontario crosses the border multiple times during production. Every barrel of oil extracted in Alberta flows through American pipelines. Our agricultural products, our manufactured goods, our services, all of it depends on seamless access to the American market. The Bank of Canada has already warned that U.S. tariffs have weakened our economy. Exports are down sharply. GDP growth is projected at barely 1% for 2026. Business investment has been weak across sectors largely because of elevated uncertainty. By the end of 2026, the bank projects GDP will be about 1.5% lower than it would have been without American tariffs. And that projection assumes current tariff levels remain stable. It does not account for what happens if Section 301 investigations result in additional permanent tariffs. Industries already affected by Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles have seen their GDP decline by 4% in 2025. The aluminum sector alone contracted by 15.5%. Motor vehicle body and trailer manufacturing fell by 11.6%. These are not abstract statistics. These are factories closing. These are workers being laid off. These are communities being hollowed out across this country. And now the Trump administration is building the legal framework for more. The Section 301 investigation is not just about forced labor. Greer indicated there could be additional investigations over issues such as digital service taxes, pharmaceutical drug pricing, ocean pollution, and other possibilities. The list of potential grievances is endless. The mechanism for imposing tariffs based on those grievances is now being constructed. Prime Minister Mark Carney has emerged as perhaps the most vocal critic of American economic coercion among world leaders. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney delivered remarks that were widely interpreted as a direct challenge to Trump's trade policies. He spoke of a rupture in the world order. He warned that middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. He called for smaller countries to link up and counter the United States. Trump responded the very next day from the same forum. Canada lives because of the United States, Trump declared. They should be grateful to us, Canada. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He was not so grateful. They should be grateful to us, Canada. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your remarks. This is the language being used to describe our nation by the president of our closest ally. Canada lives because of the United States, as if we are not a sovereign nation, as if our history, our achievements, our contributions to the world mean nothing. As if we exist at the pleasure of Washington. This is not diplomatic rhetoric. This is the language of dominance. This is the language of annexation dressed up as trade policy. Carney's response was defiant. In Parliament, he said, the world has changed. Washington has changed. There is almost nothing normal in the United States now, and that is the truth. When Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent claimed Carney had aggressively walked back his Davos remarks during a phone call with Trump, Carney rejected it flatly. To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos. Carney stated, Carney has set a goal for Canada to double its non-U.S. exports in the next decade. He has spent nearly a quarter of his first year in office traveling abroad, pursuing new trade agreements on 4 continents, 12 new economic and security accords in 6 months, a strategic partnership with China that lifts tariffs on Canadian canola, lobster, and other agricultural products, agreements with Indonesia, frameworks with the UAE, discussions with India and ASEAN and Mercosur. This is trade diversification on an unprecedented scale. But diversification takes time. The infrastructure to pivot Canadian exports to new markets does not exist overnight. New LNG terminals, expanded port facilities, rail, connections. All of these take years to build. And in the meantime, 75% of our exports still cross that border south. 75% of our economic lifeblood still flows through a relationship that is growing more hostile by the day. The history of Section 301 should terrify us. When Trump launched the investigation against China in 2018, the stated goal was to address intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer. The actual result was a fundamental restructuring of the global trading system. Supply chains that had taken decades to build were torn apart. Companies that had invested billions in Chinese manufacturing scrambled to relocate. The tariffs were supposed to bring China to the negotiating table. Instead, they triggered retaliation. China imposed tariffs on American agricultural products. American farmers needed bailouts. American consumers paid higher prices. And the trade deficit with China barely moved. Now imagine that playbook applied to Canada. We are not an adversary. We are an ally. We fought alongside Americans in every major conflict of the last century. We share the world's longest undefended border. Our intelligence services collaborate daily. Our militaries exercise together. Our peoples are connected by family ties, by business partnerships, by a shared commitment to democratic values. And yet, we are being investigated under the same legal framework used to target China. The forced labor justification is particularly gling. Canada already has legislation intended to curb forced labor in supply chains. We require annual reports to the federal government. We have rules forbidding forced labor and free trade agreements. The Federal Register notice from the U.S. Trade Representative acknowledges that Canada has adopted measures intended to stop the importation or sale of products produced using forced labor. So what exactly is being investigated? The effectiveness of our enforcement efforts, according to one legal expert. In other words, the United States is not alleging that Canada uses forced labor. The United States is investigating whether our enforcement of forced labor prohibitions meets American standards. This is a pretext. This is a fig leaf. This is a mechanism to impose tariffs for reasons that have nothing to do with forced labor. Trade lawyer Ryan Maduris, who served as an assistant general counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative during the first Trump administration, says the focus will undoubtedly be on the effectiveness of enforcement efforts. He expects the investigation will find whatever it needs to find to justify the tariffs the administration has already decided it wants to impose. Section 301 is not an objective assessment of trade practices. It is a political tool wielded by an administration that has made tariffs the centerpiece of its economic policy. And where does this leave us? Where does this leave Canadian exporters who wake up every morning wondering if their business model will survive another year? Where does this leave factory workers in Windsor and Oshawa whose livelihoods depend on the auto industry? Where does this leave farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta whose crops need access to American markets? Where does this leave all of us who have built our economy on the assumption that trade with our neighbor would remain fundamentally stable? The Canada-U.S. relationship has weathered storms before. We navigated the softwood lumber disputes. We survived the challenges of the original free trade negotiations. We found ways to work through disagreements over agricultural subsidies and cultural exemptions and 100 other irritants. But those disputes happened within a framework of mutual respect. They happened between partners who understood they needed each other. They happened when American leadership still believed in the rules-based international order that the United States itself had created. That framework is gone. Trump has made clear he does not believe in rules-based trade. He believes in leverage. He believes in coercion. He believes that economic might makes right. And Canada, for all our strengths, does not have the economic might to stand toe-to-toe with the United States in a trade war. We are David facing Goliath, and Goliath has made clear he intends to use every weapon at his disposal. What can we do? First, we must understand that this fight will not be won by capitulation. Giving Trump what he wants on dairy or alcohol or any other specific issue will not satisfy him. The demands will keep coming. The investigations will keep launching. The tariffs will keep threatening. This is not about specific trade irritants. This is about establishing dominance. And dominance, by definition, can never be fully satisfied because there is always more to demand. Second, we must accelerate diversification, even knowing it will take time. Every trade agreement we sign with partners outside the United States is a small step toward reducing our vulnerability. The agreement with China that Trump condemned is precisely the kind of deal we need more of. Not because we should align with Beijing, not because we should abandon our values, but because we need options. We need leverage of our own. We need the ability to say no without facing economic ruin. Third, we must invest in ourselves. The federal government has announced significant infrastructure projects, including expansion of the Port of Montreal, implementation of many nuclear reactors in Ontario, and a liquefied natural gas terminal in British Columbia. These projects are not just about economic growth. They are about building the physical capacity to trade with the world beyond the United States. They are about creating alternatives that did not exist before. Fourth, we must maintain our unity. The Trump administration's strategy includes trying to divide us province against province, industry against industry, Canadian against Canadian. There are already reports of U.S. officials meeting with separatists seeking independence for Alberta. This is not speculation. This is documented. The United States is actively trying to fracture our country as a negotiating tactic. We cannot let that succeed. Our strength in this fight comes from standing together. The Section 301 investigation will proceed through public consultations and reports. There will be hearings. There will be submissions. The formal process will create an appearance of fairness and objectivity, but we should have no illusions about the outcome. The Trump administration has already decided what it wants. The investigation is simply the mechanism to get there. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc says, "We are committed to working with our KSMA partners to further a North American approach to tackling forced labor in international supply chains." This is diplomatic language that signals a willingness to engage with the process. But engaging with the process is not the same as winning the process. We can participate in every hearing, submit every document, make every argument, and still face tariffs at the end because the decision was never really about the evidence. The Supreme Court ruling that struck down Trump's EPA tariffs gave us temporary relief. Most Canadian goods that are KSMA compliant will continue to avoid the worst of the tariffs, but KSMA itself is up for review this year. Trump has suggested he may let it expire. And even compliant goods are vulnerable if the trade relationship deteriorates further. The exemption only matters as long as both sides want it to matter. And Trump has made clear he sees trade agreements as things to be torn up rather than honored. We are entering a period that may be the most difficult in the history of Canada-U.S. economic relations. The rules that govern that relationship for decades have been shredded. The norms of diplomatic engagement have been abandoned. The assumption that our interests would be protected by shared values has been proven naive. What we are left with is raw power politics. And in raw power politics, the stronger party usually wins. But Canada has never been just a smaller version of the United States waiting to be absorbed. We built this country on different principles. We chose a different path. Our identity is not defined by our proximity to America, but by our distinctness from it. And that distinctness, that stubborn insistence on being our own nation with our own values and our own future, is what Trump and his administration find so infuriating. They want compliance. They want deference. They want us to accept that Canada lives because of the United States, and we will not. We cannot. We must not. The Section 301 investigation into Canada is a test. It is a test of our resolve, our unity, our willingness to endure economic pain for the sake of our sovereignty. The months ahead will be difficult. There will be layoffs. There will be business closures. There will be communities struggling to survive. And through all of it, we will be tempted to give in, to accept whatever terms Trump demands, to become the compliant junior partner that his administration believes we should be. We must resist that temptation. We must remember who we are. We must remember that sovereignty cannot be traded away for a few percentage points of GDP growth. We must remember that our children and grandchildren will inherit not just an economy, but a country. And that country must still be free to make its own choices, pursue its own interests, determine its own future. Donald Trump believes that tariffs are leveraged to force capitulation. Let us prove him wrong. Let us show the world that a middle power can stand up to a superpower.